Welcoming you to a life of awareness, the Presence Project is excited for you to join us for today's podcast with your host, Paul Kerzner.
Hello and welcome to episode 56 of Are You Being Present? My name is Paul Kerzner. I want to welcome you to the present moment. I want to welcome you to the here and now. And I want to thank you wholeheartedly, sincerely, and deeply for joining me in this amazing and unprecedented present moment. The title and topic for today's podcast is Pivoting with Presence. And I decided to speak on this subject because I talk often about pivoting in clinic. It's certainly a question I ask myself often, am I pivoting? Do I have the ability to pivot in any given present moment? And it's certainly a tool that I'd love to present at this time because I feel like it'll be a good addition to all the other presence tools that we've spoken about. So what does it mean to pivot, and what does presence have to do with pivoting? Two very good questions for sure. Pivoting is a behavior almost. And what I mean by that is that, being able to pivot means that you have the ability to shift. You have the ability to grow. You have the ability to evolve in any given present moment, regardless of the circumstances that are showing up for you. There are certain things that take place that can be challenging than others because, life is full of peaks and valleys, and we've talked about that before. But through the peaks and the valleys, it's important to be able to pivot. That's something that I look at often, is because as I enter into a moment and say that there are a variety of potential triggers, I have to really watch myself, because if I become resistant in that moment, I lose the ability to pivot into a different direction. And of course, we talked about acceptance. I've done 2 podcasts on that, number 9 and number 55. And acceptance plays a very large role in our ability to pivot in any given moment, in any given situation, in any given circumstance. The more accepting you are of the things that are showing up for you, the greater your ability is going to be to pivot in that moment. And, that's really important because, of course, acceptance is one of the key presence tools that allow for an alleviation of self-inflicted suffering. So within that paradigm, we look at pivoting, because what we would do first is accept the things that are showing up, regardless of how we feel, and then pivot. By pivoting, we shift our attention, we shift our perceptions, we shift our energy into a different direction. And, the more seamless this transition, this pivot can be, the less you're going to suffer, the less self-inflicted suffering that's going to be created on your own behalf. Over the past 9 years, I've had the wonderful opportunity to sit in front of many, many people in all different walks of life, all different circumstances, because we're all born into unique circumstances, even though as humans, we're not very different from one another, but, different shades of gray. And one of the things that I've observed time and time again is that the most successful people, and when I say successful, I don't necessarily mean wealthy, but the most successful people in life exhibit an ability to pivot in any given circumstance, in any given situation, regardless of their triggers or their feelings. And it's not something that I think is inherent. I think it's something that people work toward. And it's a process like anything else. So we have to learn how to pivot, and there are a few things that we have to do before we get to the actual pivoting, which is we have to be present. We have to be in a state of acceptance. We have to be the observer more than anything of what's going on inside of us. And there are definitely certain times where pivoting can be more challenging than others. But regardless of whatever the circumstances are, regardless of whatever's happening for you, the ability to pivot will allow you to enter into that flow state, because you're not getting hung up, you're not getting stuck, you're not getting stagnant in a moment, regardless of whatever that moment brings for you, however it's unfolding for you. So a good question at this point is, what is an obstacle to pivoting? And I would tell you unequivocally that being expectational, having expectations, will definitely get in the way of your ability to pivot in any moment. As you go throughout your day and if you create these expectations for how you perceive things should be, that definitely gets in the way of our ability to pivot and shift, because very rarely does reality meet or coalesce with our expectations. And expectations almost always tend to lead to a level of disappointment, to frustration, and subsequently more suffering. And living an expectational life definitely creates a lot of self-inflicted suffering. And that's just not going to work. And it's certainly not recommended, but it's definitely something that I recommend looking at. And I have talked about expectations in the past. And when I've talked about having expectations, I talk about the inverse, which is living intentionally. So if you can shift away from having an expectational perception and living your life with more intention, that gives you the ability to pivot. And just an example is like whenever you're traveling, more often than not, our plans when we travel don't go the way that we expect. And that definitely creates friction. If we have a more intentional perception when we're traveling or going through our day-to-day life, it gives us the ability to shift and pivot and to adapt to how things are showing up. That will lead to a reduction in suffering, especially self-inflicted suffering. And how do we know if we're being intentional versus expectational? You have to be present. You have to be the observer of your thoughts and see where they're headed. You have to be the observer of that ego thought stream, of that ego mind. The ego wants you to be expectational. It wants to create expectations for you because it knows that life rarely meets up with those expectations, and it will pull you out of the present moment. That it's really easy to get triggered when your expectations don't come to fruition. And so that's a presence obstacle for sure. So definitely being observant and trying to live your life more intentionally will allow you to pivot so much more seamlessly. And, that alone is definitely a really good and very handy presence tool that you could pack away in your presence toolbox, the ability to pivot. And, I could tell you personally that I ask myself often as I get into certain peaks, certain challenges, certain triggers more than anything, is like, am I pivoting? Do I have the ability to pivot in this moment? Can I shift the way that I'm seeing this? And that, and of course, like, there are times that are easier than others to pivot. But I will tell you, regardless of whatever's showing up and regardless of however I feel, I know deep down that my ability to pivot is quintessential in my desire not to suffer, not to create more suffering for myself. So I'm always looking for the pivot. I'm always looking and seeing if I'm getting too stuck in a moment, if I'm holding on too tightly, if I'm not allowing things to flow through, if I'm not reminding myself that these present moments won't last. Just reminding myself of that simple fact allows for the pivot, because I remind myself that there's an impermanence to this moment, and it's going to be replaced by this present moment, which is going to be replaced by this present moment. And I want the ability to pivot within each present moment so that I don't have to create more friction and more suffering for myself. So what I'm really trying to say here is learning how to pivot, taking the steps necessary to pivoting, will reduce your suffering in any given present moment. And I can tell you that with 100% assurance because I've watched my patients either pivot or resist the pivot and create more suffering for themselves. And subsequently, I've also watched myself and asked myself in those moments about, am I pivoting? Do I need to pivot? Do I want to pivot? And, I've through my own trials and tribulations, I could tell you that to me, in this present moment, pivoting is definitely something that I value. It's something that I work on. It's something that I remind myself of constantly, because we get stuck in these loops, in these mental loops, especially when we're not being present. And that really prevents our ability, first and foremost, to be present, but secondarily, to be able to shift our perceptions and pivot out of a moment that isn't necessarily working for us. And that takes a level of honesty, of looking at how things are progressing in your life and, owning that whatever you're doing is not necessarily working. And that's okay, because it's not about being right or wrong or being judgmental. It's more about being accepting of how things are evolving, and having a very clear observer role, so you don't allow your ego to get intertwined in the observation itself. I think it's important that I just conversationally circle this topic, because I can understand how some people would find the idea of pivoting to be a little challenging. But really it's not. It's actually a very simple presence tool. It just takes work, and you're going to be given many, many opportunities and many present moments to shift, to evolve, and to pivot into a different mind state, into a different feeling space. And you're going to see time and time again that the more seamless the pivot is, the more accepting that you are, the more allowing you are of letting things go, of accepting that nothing's really going to last, everything's constantly changing, is going to alleviate the pressure that you're putting on yourself. And that's really, it's a rough reality when we're hard on ourselves, when we're constantly criticizing ourselves, when we can't take a step back and be more supportive and have that level of clarity that's going to allow us to be present. And pivoting is such an important behavior that needs to be valued and certainly exercised on a daily basis, sometimes on a moment-to-moment basis. So the question, another question that you should really be presenting is, do I need to pivot? Am I allowing myself to pivot in this moment? And how is that going to help me? I don't need to answer those questions for you. Those answers are going to be completely subjective to the reality that you're currently involved in. And I wouldn't have taken all this time with you if I didn't believe that pivoting is such an important facet of presence. And all the things that we've done and spoke about up until this point have led to me presenting a topic like pivoting, so that you can inject it into all the other tools that you've used and just live a life that's so much smoother, that's so much easier, that doesn't involve all that extra self-inflicted suffering that we do to ourselves at the hands of an unguarded mind, at the hands of an unguarded ego. And as we've talked about, that ego is tricky. So be present. Don't fight the ego. Just observe it. Really look at any resistance that you might be carrying. Shift into more of a state of acceptance. And remember, the pivot is always there for you. It's always there. Do you have the level of clarity to see it? Are you allowing yourself to pivot? Or are you navigating this world with a level of expectation that's just creating a lot of friction in your life that's completely unnecessary? So I think that's good. I think that I've touched upon pivoting in a variety of facets. And it's my hope that after listening to this podcast, that you'll understand what it means to pivot, and more importantly, that you'll start pivoting as you go throughout your present moments. So with all that said, I want to thank you for listening, and I want to welcome you back to the present moment.
Thank you for listening to the Are You Being Present podcast, brought to you by the Presence Projects. Remember, you have a choice. Choose to be present.